Could a contrast between the American Revolution and the French Revolution be relevant to today's conflicts? I think so. The attempt to demote historic icons, like George Washington, is a case in point. George Washington grew up as a gentleman farmer in Virginia and was a fourth-generation slave owner. But by the end of his life, he had decided slavery was immoral, and so at his death, he freed his slaves and made provision for them. But in our day, where the alleged right to not be offended often seems to trump the constitutional right to free speech, some are calling for images of George Washington to be torn down, like statues of Confederates. The Daily Wire. May 2, 2019, reports on how George Washington High School in Northern California is contemplating tearing down two 1930s panels featuring George Washington because the pair of murals allegedly traumatizes students and community members. This is in San Francisco, so the outcome seems likely. How long will our historical iconoclasm last? The cultural Marxists are working overtime to cut Americans off from our history. I believe that despite his flaws, including being a slave owner, there are many heroic aspects of our first president. Dr. Peter Lilbach and I wrote, George Washington's Sacred Fire, which puts all this in context. Recently we discussed Washington and slavery. Our founders fought the American Revolution, led by Washington, so that we could enjoy our God-given rights. Though slow in coming, recognition of those God-given rights eventually gave the slaves their freedom. What is happening in the culture wars today is a revival of the French Revolution, which waged war against God. France in 1789 fought against injustice, even in the church, but their godless cure ended up being worse than the disease. The French Revolution was anti-God and pro-tyranny, leading to death in the streets. The American Revolution was pro-God and pro-freedom. America's founders mentioned God 4 times in the Declaration of Independence. They identified King George III's tyranny as illegitimate, because he was violating our God-given rights. The founders, with a firm reliance on the Lord, laid down their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor in support for their declaration as a new nation. When George Washington first read the Declaration to his troops, one of his first acts was to hire Christian chaplains, systematically, throughout the army. He felt that if we were to win this war, it would only be with God's help.